was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around other people's elections, Joe?
Welcome to another episode of the Rackets Podcast. This episode is going to cover China's connection with organized crime. Went into a lot of detail on the last episode, really pointing out how, in many cases, the Chinese government will essentially partner with different notorious gangsters, something the United States has done for years, have documented quite often. For example, how a lot of drug traffickers are tied to the CIA. In many cases, an intelligence agency will use a crime figure like that because they have leverage. And in turn, those crime figures have a lot to offer. They're usually involved in some form of corruption with government officials. So there's just a lot of compromise information available there as well. So the last episode, I was highlighting a person nicknamed Broken Tooth. He's one of the triad leaders there, and really showed how he had the sort of normal criminal, archetype there in history, but suddenly he becomes this sort of patriotic gangster, and he's sort of really touting the CCP's, propaganda line there, and how it really benefited him. Again, there is always going to be a certain level of deniability when it comes to this topic. So I do hope that you keep an open mind. But I think, again, by the end of the episode, you will really agree with me that there's a lot of these organized crime figures who are essentially in bed with the Chinese government because there is a mutually beneficial relationship there. So again, we talked about how, Broken Tooth, he has all different types of connections. So there's this massive company that he has ties to. So Chow Tai Fook Enterprises, actually a Hong Kong-based company. Their child company is one of the largest foreign investors in China. So obviously like a really tight relationship there with the government, roughly $16.5 billion, a lot of real estate purchased via that company. And that company has been in the news quite a bit over the last few years, and not in a flattering way. It's primarily known as a jewelry retailer. It's one of the largest jewelry retailers in Asia. So again, I don't want to make it sound as though this is some company that is entirely stained, or I guess entirely profiting from organized crime, when I would say it's really kind of the opposite. It's mostly this legitimate business, but it does seem to have a lot of these ties to organized crime. So it's a part of its profit stream. And it's really, again, become more of a story over the last few years due to Australian regulators and the casino industry really doing their job, and this information coming to surface. So just a few months ago, this massive casino in Australia, close to $4 billion was invested into it. And Chow Tai Fook is, one of the partners in this company. And as a result, among other issues with Star Entertainment, that's the main host of this casino company here, there's just been in all kinds of legal problems with the Australian government. Over the years, multiple $100 million fines, usually something to do with, again, money laundering violations, connections to organized crime. At one point, Star Entertainment actually had to halt their trading. And again, comes back to this connection with this company that has a tight relationship there with the Chinese government and its connections to organized crime. And this report that I'm going to point to, this 2022 report by the Australia's version of ABC, Australian Broadcast Corporation, pointed out, again, Broken Tooth ties to that company, and really a number of other connections with organized crime. So the company, I think, was founded, if I remember right, back in like the 1930s. So again, the origins are a legitimate basis, but it just, the founder veered off, right? So the founder of the company in the 1980s formed a partnership with Stanley Ho in some of these VIP rooms in the Macau casinos. So in the last episode, we talked about Stanley Ho. He's essentially sort of like the Bugsy Siegel of Macau. Macau was really sort of just a dusty town, kind of a crime-ridden town, and eventually was able to turn it into this VIP high roller kind of a gambling town where now Macau's gambling revenues, I think, double the Nevada casinos. Now, one of the things that discussed in the last episode is how there is sort of organized crime and corruption are built into the Macau business model. The reason being they're catering primarily to Chinese high rollers. And in China, there's a law where you can't take more than $5,000 per year outside of the country. So what do? The Macau casinos have to lean on almost primarily, for their high rollers, these triads. They're essentially the loan sharks, and they're the collector and the debt collectors for these casinos. So, as was illustrated in this report by ABC back in 2022, Stanley Ho and the founder of Chow Tai Fook Enterprises were deeply involved with these organized crime figures. So there's just no other way to run those casinos there in Macau without that relationship. And again, the report went into all kinds of other ties, with organized crime. So in some ways, that was really something that was in the past, right? Which is really accurate. Again, the founder of the company, he passed away in 2020. That report was released in 2022. But there are more current ties. And one of those people that the company is connected with is a person who's definitely an organized crime figure, very high level, Alvin Chow, who I'm going to go in a little more into in the future. Basically, they created all these different cutouts to have a silent partnership with the casino for Alvin Chow, who's another one of those. He's really your more current junket operator who has many of those VIP rooms in Macau, but several countries, Russia, Cambodia, Malaysia, you name it, several different countries, those types of operations. But he's somebody who was arrested and convicted a few years ago for like over 100 different types of charges related to organized crime. Again, I'm going to get into him a little more so in a second, but just really kind of wanted to focus on, again, this company that has this tight relationship with the Chinese government and their connections with organized crime. And as a result of that tight relationship, they were able to take over this resort in the Bahamas called Baha Mar. It's a resort that's had close to $4 billion in investment put into it. And as you can see on the title of this slide, I openly call it a theft. And I think that you'll come to a very similar conclusion. But I just kind of want to, let's just back up for a second, give you a little background on the Baha Mar. So there's a Bahamian resident. He's not a citizen. He's a billionaire, I think born in Switzerland, Armenian descent, very well-known philanthropist. So in the mid-2000s comes up with the concept for Baha Mar, essentially, gambling is part of it, but just this resort, and it has become, it's one of the larger resorts there in the Bahamas. But what happens is the financial crash of 2007, 2008 can't get enough financing to complete the construction for the deal. So in 2000, he partners with the China Export-Import Bank and gets the financing that he needs to get the construction done. Close to $2.5 billion is loaned to the Baha Mar Corporation, right? So there's been years of this buildup, and all with the intent of opening there in 2015. Part of that loan deal is you had to use this state-owned company called China Construction America. That was the contractor for the construction. And long story short, they weren't able to complete the project on time. And eventually the Baha Corporation had to go into bankruptcy. And who's able to come in there and swoop up the deal? It's Chow Tai Fook. The dollar figure is not announced. It is undisclosed. But when you see something like that where there's been a bankruptcy involved, obviously they're getting a major discount. So you might be thinking, well, that's just kind of normal. Stuff like that happens all the time where a company, contractors, they can't meet the deadlines and the original founder has to file for bankruptcy. Stuff like that happens a lot. And it's true. There was a recent ruling in a New York State court providing a $1.6 billion judgment against the Chinese contractor. This case here, that's going to be there in the show notes. But I want to kind of go over, high level and go into why. Really why I would call that a theft. And again, we have to think about it, right? If this company is essentially stolen, well, actually, let me just kind of get a little bit more into the details first. So this New York State court rules against that Chinese contractor for $1.6 billion, right? So the founder of that company had $845 million equity stake in the company. And what happened was, if you read those documents, I mean, I'm just kind of putting a few bullet points to highlight everything here, but basically an absolute sham and a shakedown of the founder. So that one of the highlights there that they're pointing out is this $54 million. So when CCA, when it was getting close to the deadline, they kept promising them, okay, we will get this done. We will get this done on deadline, but we need, they kept just requesting more and more money as they went along. In particular, they asked for $54 million, and they said it was to pay their subcontractors. But what actually they were doing, the court documents show, they took that exact same amount of money and they purchased the Hilton property that's also on the island of Nassau there in the Bahamas. And again, internal documents there show, emails where it says things like, you can't fake things in such an obvious way. You're going to get yourselves in trouble. If you want to do this, you must be careful. So essentially what this company, this state-owned Chinese construction company was doing was just defrauding this founder and just eventually drove him into bankruptcy because they never were able to complete they did, obviously. This resort's been there on time, but they kept delaying and delaying and delaying and asking for more and more money to a point to where, again, the company had to file for bankruptcy, right? We look at it, money was misappropriated by the officers. They were literally lying to the founder and saying that, okay, we're working on this, when they were internal documents were showing, no, let's take money out of this Bahamas project. Let's go put that into the Panama project. So in the end, that Bahamian founder, he had to file for bankruptcy. And again, this company that we keep talking about that has all of these ties with organized crime is able to go in there and buy the company, presumably at a major discount, right? So what's happened is, there's still a good economic stimulus there. You have this resort that provides thousands of jobs, but the money for the person who's an actual Bahamian resident there, that money has been extracted and that goes over to this Chinese conglomerate there. So in my opinion, that absolutely was a theft. And I just have to wonder why, because when you look at this company, Chinese Construction of America, it's actually a very reputable company. They've done, over $100 million contracts in the United States. There's obviously a pretty good due diligence process there, but why in this one instance are they doing it? And the only conclusion, I'm speculating, is because it just seems that there's sort of a corrupt relationship there between the Chinese government and that one company, right? So as I mentioned, Chow Tai Fook, they also had this relationship with this guy, Alvin Chow. He's the definition of a gangster. He is in prison now for over 100 different charges related to organized crime. He has ties to Broken Tooth and the 14K triad, who was, again, profiled quite a bit in the last episode. And a lot of this stuff came out because Australian regulators really were doing their job. This stuff it was all in the reports there. It's really the politicians who sort of fought against it, and you can kind of get why. When there's billions of dollars being made in this industry, that tends to have a lot of sway and a lot of influence, right? So one of the things that we really want to focus on here is, again, there's always going to be people who are organized crime figures, but really, does this person have sort of a relationship there with the Chinese government, right? So one of the things that I talked about quite a bit in that last episode was the Macau Sands. There's this internal document. This internal document is going to be in the show notes. This was this internal document that wasn't supposed to be released that did get leaked, that showed that Chinese government officials firmly believed that in this US-owned casino in Macau, that there were FBI and CIA agents actively working in compromise. They were trying to find Chinese government officials who lost a certain amount of money, and hey, we'll extend you that credit, we'll pay up your debts, but guess what? You got to work for us. You got to work for us in some form of an intelligence gathering capacity, right? So I do find that to be a credible report. In my mind, that is a credible report. So guess what? In my opinion, the Chinese government is obviously going to do some sort of counter surveillance, right? So someone like Alvin Chow, he's been in business since the 90s, right? He has an estimated, when he was arrested, had an estimated 88,000 clients in mainland China. These are high net worth individuals. He has a ton of compromise and intelligence information. For someone to operate in such a high profile manner, it was estimated to be making over $1 billion, his company, over $1 billion a year in profits from a business model that is inherently loaded with, again, corruption and all types of criminality. That's a person who has, again, who could be a very valuable asset to Chinese intelligence. And again, when we look at these different reports that are made by multiple different levels of the Australian regulators, it's just very clear that, again, he sort of built up his early ties, with the 14K triad and Broken Tooth, and eventually went out on his own and just sort of, built the same business model. One of their estimates is that he was laundering as much as $2 million per day. And eventually this did catch up to him. He was banned from entering Australia back in 2018. But again, to me, the bigger question is, like what function if any, did he serve for the Chinese government? And again, I have to believe that somebody who is allowed to operate in such a flagrant manner was, providing some level of service to the Chinese government. I mean, he was labeled as a, quote, foreign politically exposed person. Different government organizations, track that differently, but obviously some level of political sway and influence. So he was a member of a number of these different, what you call United Front organizations. They're sort of similar to the CIA has these, non-government organization cutouts that they'll use that are in the end are government funded, but really essentially working in that sort of espionage, essentially working also basically like the US State Department in a way, right? So he's also, funded and financed these different patriotic films. His company has a whole lot of different ventures. Some intelligence analysts have labeled him literally as a bagman for one of the rival factions within the CCP. And that's what, a lot of people think is that this, with him being arrested eventually a few years ago, was really more of a cleaning house. When you look at Xi Jinping's whole anti-corruption program, there seems to be a whole lot of self-interest involved in that many of the high-profile people who do end up getting arrested are really his rivals, and it's not really the people close to him. I like to point out that, and I pointed out in the last episode, you can see these reports of all these different offshore accounts and unexplained wealth, for people close to his family. And in fact, his own cousin was investigated by Australian authorities because of his links to a different junket operator who was also arrested. But again, Xi Jinping's cousin has not, faced any of that. He's been, I mean, he's literally one of these high rollers in these casinos and that tight affiliation with organized crime, not punished with his own family. But what ended up happening was, Chinese state-owned media eventually started to leak these reports that he was being investigated for all of these different things. One of the reports literally referred to so basically this proxy gambling, where again, gambling in China, even though there's this massive demand for it, is illegal. And where Chow had set up he's got the junkets for physical gambling in all these different countries, like I said, in Cambodia, Malaysia, Russia, you name it, but also these online betting sites where someone within China can then bet from that server outside of the country, which again, that is illegal activity, but it had been going on for years. And then just suddenly there in July, and their media equated it to the largest poppy flowers, again, sort of a reference to the Opium Wars, which I'm going to go into later. But yeah, that's something obviously, for Chinese government leaders, that's a very big pain point, where Western leaders literally went to war with China so that we could supply their population with cheap opium. I mean, it's a terrible point of history. And we're gonna get into that a little bit later, the relevance there. But it's a very I felt that that was a very symbolic quote in sort of these news articles, is that here's this person who had been operating in this sort of patriotic manner, and now suddenly the same actions are no longer patriotic. Also do want to point out that he wasn't arrested in China, he was arrested in Macau. They don't have that extradition agreement in place. But yeah, I mean, this was at the request of the Chinese government. I mean, that's openly been expressed by the Macau authority. So again, this person who really seems to be somehow behind the scenes, this person who was, a very patriotic gangster, for the lack of a better term, the regime at some point felt that he just wasn't doing his part. So that, if you notice, I have the same picture up here. So Dong Licheng was one of Alvin Chow's business partners, and he's got a very similar profile. At one point, he was one of the wealthiest people in the Yunnan province there that borders Myanmar, and that's part of how he made his money. Similar background in the gambling business. Those gambling businesses were not in China; they were right across the border there in Myanmar. And taking that wealth, he was able to build up legitimate business operations. One of them, the Jincheng Group. He had the first private airline in that province, again built on illegal gambling money, right? So he has, again, I would say, sort of a similar pattern in that at one point there was supposed to be arrested, but suddenly, he gets, instead of going to jail and prison, he gets a suspended sentence. And he's, again, part of these different United Front organizations. So someone who's, again, operating in a fairly flagrant manner, but the Chinese government doesn't really hold this person accountable. And at some point there in 2014, he is investigated for corruption. So what does he do? He starts setting up operations. He has operations there in China, but that business really has been going through different, bankruptcy proceedings. It's really failing there, right? So he starts to set up operations there, sets up a bank and all types of different businesses in Cambodia, and also different gambling operations. And one of those, again, in partnership with Alvin Chow. Problem is that it's not just gambling. In some cases, some of these businesses are fronts for human trafficking. And it's something that I've gone in. If this is your first time listening to the Rackets podcast, I ask you, go back and listen to the last few episodes. In Southeast Asia, there is this unbelievable problem where an estimated 100,000, 200,000 victims of human trafficking, they're being lured into these compounds where they're forced to do actual scams against the people. If you're from China, you're lured to say Myanmar or Cambodia, and you're going online and you're doing these sweetheart scams, these cryptocurrency Ponzi schemes, all these different scams, and they have to keep up a certain quota level, or else they're beaten. In some cases, they're murdered, they're tortured. It's unbelievable story. And that man, that the other faces are blurred out, but again, the person to the right there, that's Dong Licheng. And he's responsible for a few of these very notorious compounds. And the really sad thing is that there is so much government corruption. Many of the victims are Chinese. I would say the country that has the biggest problem with the most victims is China. Yet you have these organized crime figures in bed with these different foreign governments. And again, you have to assume that there's some level of complicity, because there's been many arrests, but in many cases, it's the worst offenders who still roam free. And Dong Licheng, in a court there in China, he hasn't gone to prison, but basically he's been banned from traveling, quote, indulging in unnecessary expensive purchases, and he cannot enroll his children in an expensive private school. Like, these just sort of little slaps on the wrist for someone who's involved in just one of the most horrific, unimaginable crimes. So yeah, and this is a picture here that's one of the compounds that he's an owner in there. As you can kind of see, you can look like that's almost sort of like a little ghost town there, not a lot of activity on the roads there. So I wanted to step back and talk about the special economic zone. So back in 2006, Cambodia and China agreed to this. It created a whole lot of development there. And again, I don't want to make it sound like this is all negative, but one of the things that happens in many cases with these special economic zones, because you create these tax exemptions for Chinese investors, well, guess what? There's also a lot of illicit money, a lot of organized crime that is drawn to the area. And the initial response was very good back in 2006. Xi Jinping is literally called that the model. It's really sort of the model for the Belt and Road. There's a lot of good infrastructure spending, a lot of good positive developments that came out of it. The problem is, again, there's just so much to it. First of all, major land grabs. The military of Cambodia went in there and they forced over 100 families out of their home, literally stole their land. It's a common story there with Cambodia, where the military does that. It's one of the worst countries in the world as far as land rights, where the government, again, just by force comes in and takes your property so they can bulldoze it and put some sort of new development in there that will attract new tourist dollars. But again, there's a strategic value to this. It's the only seaport in Cambodia was built there. But just to kind of illustrate how in many ways these special economic zones are sort of like a client state for China. At one point, there was a coal plant in China where the pollution was so bad, they had to shut it down. They're just like, oh, well, what we'll do is we'll just go replace this in that special economic zone in Cambodia. And there were plans and there was progress, but eventually there was enough protest to where that was stopped. But in the end, you can see how there's just, again, so much corruption there. And there's an open joke there in Cambodia that only generals with 2 stars or more are able to own land in these special economic zones, just again with the crony capitalism that is attached to it. So in Sihanoukville, that's again that special economic zone there was this massive casino boom that happened from 2016 to 2019. 70 casinos were built. I think roughly about $2 billion worth of investment went into the town, and almost all of this was catered towards Chinese gamblers. So it sort of became a new Macau in a way, right? And I think that the level of this of what was happening there, the Chinese government eventually pressured the Cambodian government to shut this down, right? It was just too much criminality. The levels were, it was just out of control, right? So the Cambodian government did abide and put in place a shutdown order in August of 2019 that was supposed to go into effect, effective for January 1st. And the Chinese government even sent in their own police officers to help shut this down and made several different arrests and basically shut all of that casino business down for the most part. And what happened was that a whole lot of that business and the organized crime figures, they moved to Myanmar. And that's what, if you go back a couple episodes, if you haven't heard it, that's where a lot of this derives from, is shutting down that town. But I do want to point out how there's a certain level of selective enforcement. And there's one of these particular casinos that's owned by the prime minister's nephew, Hunto, who's pictured there, has a lot of these secondary connections to some really high level criminal efforts. But he's always like one cut out away to where you can't directly tie him to it, but his business partners in many cases are. But yeah, there's a news report of this one particular casino that's allowed to open. Again, they're openly catering to Chinese gambling, Chinese gambling website. And again, it's because there's this certain level of crony capitalism. And again, the Chinese authorities are going through, they're shutting all that down, but there's a certain one that's allowed to stay open. And there's none of this and none of the interference from the government, right? So with that in mind, I really wanted to point to this particular person, the man on the left there, you can see part of, again, how are you able to do this and operate with such flagrant criminality? Some of it's just good old fashioned bribery and corruption, right? So Zhu Amin is a Chinese fugitive, a former CCC official. He was operating over a $1 billion illegal gambling operation in China. And I kind of want to put some little quote marks in there. He was, again, always ahead of the authorities, right? 1 week before his company was raided, and I think like 30 or 40 of his associates were arrested. He had traveled to Hong Kong. He set up another like front company for its operations. And, while he's in Hong Kong, he's being investigated, for these different crimes. An Interpol red notice was, issued, for his arrest. Well, guess what? He had fled a month earlier to Cambodia. Again, that could all be coincidence, but we'll kind of get into this a little further here. But he sets up a business partnership with, sort of a Cambodian version of a princeling. He's the son-in-law of one of the more corrupt senators there. By the way, that senator owns a chain of casinos that also is involved or has these ties to those human trafficking scam compounds. And Zhu, I mean, he also sets up a casino there in that same special economic zone that we just mentioned. Again, they literally opened doors a couple months after. It's not like it was this existing business. They opened doors a couple months after the gambling ban has been announced, and they're openly operating there. And this is one of the better known, high profile. Again, I want to back up a second there with Chinese language website. They are openly seeking Chinese language customers, and the Chinese government has done a really good job of shutting down a lot of these different operators. But again, one of the most high profile examples is someone who's a former CCC or CCP official who's been able to get away from justice and operating. Again, the KB Hotel it's one of the more notorious examples there in Cambodia for human trafficking. And for years, China has gone after and has shut down a number of his different operations, and a number of his associates in Cambodia have been extradited to China. But again, not the high level figure. And in my opinion, that could just be again, normal corruption where you've got corrupt Cambodian officials who just won't allow that to happen. But in my opinion, I think this is another one of those examples where it does seem to be where there is some sort of back channel communication. This is a person who's obviously has a whole lot of compromise and good intelligence operation. Information. In my opinion, this is someone who probably is working with the Chinese government. This person, Zhao Wai, is arguably one of the biggest organized crime figures in Southeast Asia. So I've got the picture there of the King's Roman Casino. Like this really is the epicenter of crime. So we keep talking about these special economic zones, right? So his company established a special economic zone in Laos where they set up a 99-year lease. Again, very similar terms to some of these other agreements that were established by the Chinese government. Basically, this guy pretty much owns 12 square miles of criminality there. And it's very easy access there for Chinese tourists. Billboards are set to Chinese language. The clocks are set to Beijing time. They openly, the preferred currency is Chinese currency, right? So this compound, it is 80% owned by his company and 20% owned by the Laos government. So first of all, you just have to, there has to have been a tremendous amount of bribery and corruption involved to allow something like that, first of all, to occur, and for something like this to be going on for looking at close to 20 years now, right? He is responsible for a massive level of drug trafficking, human trafficking, in many cases, underage victims. We're talking sex trafficking. We're also talking about really high numbers of individuals who've been rescued from those scam compounds there. Where I first found out about this individual many years ago is because of the wildlife trafficking. So, you have these problems with elephants being poached there in Africa, all types of different endangered species, but there is a black market demand for a lot of this stuff. And apparently this casino, it's really all done out in the open there, where this type of wildlife trafficking, the end consumer purchases a whole lot of this stuff. It's, again, very flagrant. It's all out in the open. And this person is, again, one of the most notorious criminals in Southeast Asia. And he's allowed to open with really sort of almost a diplomatic status. There's no level of accountability. Read this one report by the crisis group, and they were seeing $1 million cash transactions there in the casino, and not even a hint of documentation. This really is a money laundering hub. So you pretty much whatever you can name it as far as criminality, it's going on there, right? And this is someone who's, again, from Macau, has a Hong Kong-based business, and who is tied to the 14K triad. He got his start there, similar to other examples I've given. He starts up a border town casino, takes those funds, and really builds it into this. What I found interesting is that there's at least some sort of secondary tie there, but the United Wa State Army, who I covered a couple episodes back, which is basically they're a non-state actor. They're basically their own country within a country. They control a fairly large amount of territory there in Myanmar, and really their main connection for weapons is the Chinese government, right? They wouldn't have that power if it wasn't for the Chinese government, and it's very similar. They're in the Wa region there, China really is the primary language. It's Chinese culture, but one of their holding company, I should say front companies, where they conduct a certain level of business, happens to have the exact same address as where the King's Roman Casino Corporation it has the exact same address. Again, that could be a coincidence. I don't think that is a coincidence. So here's this person who on the surface, China, I mean, China should have used all of their diplomatic pressure to have arrested nearly 20 years ago. I mean, he is about as flagrant as it gets. The United States has sanctioned him for basically every crime you can imagine. But again, this is in Cambodia that in no way will bend over for the United States. It's really sort of a client state to China. And again, this is a person who has a major strategic value to China. You can see him there pictured receiving the Medal of Bravery from the Laos government. So if you're looking for a source for compromise and really good intelligence information, it's somebody who's obviously involved in all kinds of corruption and has access to high-level government officials in Laos. Well, that's why. He's visited by the former president there. And it, again, sort of has this archetype of some of the others where he's even involved in some of this infrastructure spending there. They're building a $50 million port in the region. And again, he has this background with these Chinese United Front organizations. So we're just seeing this repetitive theme. And according to one of the reports I've been is he even does openly meet with these different Chinese officials. Here's this person who's again responsible for every type of crime imaginable, but again is sort of acting, I guess you could call it, like in a diplomatic status with the Chinese government, right? So I mentioned the opium wars before, and I really want to point out this connection that the Chinese government has with the rise of fentanyl. And I don't think that this is by accident. I think that anybody who really looks into this, I think really would have to conclude that this is by design. And again, there were wars fought over this roughly 150 years ago in reverse, right? So the Chinese people, the Chinese government didn't want their people to have access to this cheap opium that the West was trying to supply them with. So this is really in reverse, I think, what we're seeing today, right? So if you're not aware, the Chinese government is very strict and fairly effective with reducing the demand for illegal drugs in their country. I'm in no way an advocate for the death penalty for drugs. You'll see in some countries such as Iran where it doesn't seem to really have any type of effect. There's a very high level of, in other words, I don't think that there's a correlation. Well, there is some level of a correlation, but there's an overstep. Long story short, drug trafficking is highly illegal and strongly prosecuted in China. In many cases, if you're a high level trafficker, they do use the death penalty. So the government takes that very seriously. For the Chinese people, they do not want domestic demand within China, right? So this author, Ben Westhoff, you may be familiar with that book, Fentanyl Inc. He's done congressional hearings. He's testified before Congress multiple times. So long story short, he traveled to China. He infiltrated some of these manufacturers that were sending the fentanyl that's eventually going to the different drug traffickers and making its way to the United States and all across the world, right? It's had this unbelievable. The overdose deaths in the United States were at a fairly steady level for a while, but then once fentanyl became very common, the levels just exploded. It's where, you always see the news reports of people walking around sort of like zombies in the streets. This really does sort of seem to be like an indirect form of warfare by the Chinese government of what they're doing here. So for many years, the U.S. government did pressure the Chinese government to take a stand. In 2019, China did ban the fentanyl production, right? But this was really sort of, in my opinion, sort of an empty gesture because the cartels are still able to purchase the precursor chemicals so that they can make the fentanyl for themselves. There's really just been sort of a shift. The particular company that Ben Westhoff that he really exposed, that company it's not just that they were, making all of this fentanyl, but they were receiving government subsidies from the Chinese government. So the US government, as in particular, sort of made, the founder of that company really the face of this. And they put a $5 million reward, for his arrest. But his company still operates there. He's faced no retribution. This is all really all out in the open. So I'm going to point to this particular report. So 2019, there's some level of positive regulation there by the Chinese government, but we're now finishing out 2024, right? So what has happened since in those 5 years? I'm going to point to this report. You can look this over at your leisure. It's in the show notes. I'm going to kind of give you really the bullet points. And in my opinion, there's really been no real progress. So what this report pointed out is they found 37,000 different Chinese companies selling illegal drugs, including the precursor for Trank, right? That's another one of these drugs that's become popularized, and it's just devastating people, right? So there are many examples where it's not just the fact that the Chinese government isn't shutting this down, and it's something that they would never allow the Chinese population to use this type of stuff. It's that they're actually providing tax rebates and grants for these manufacturers, in some cases, multiple times. Several cases, there are government officials who are visiting these facilities. In some cases, these are state-owned companies. In that report, you can go through and you can find multiple examples where these are state-owned companies. And again, there's just, in my opinion, there's no other way to look at this, is that the Chinese government this is something that is intentional, and this is by design. And yeah, you could essentially call it like the 21st century version of the Opium War. One of the things I do want to point out is in that first Opium War, that's when Britain gained Hong Kong. Went over the history of that a bit, and I think the last episode or 2 episodes back. But yeah, that's it. I think that there's a sort of a symbolic nature to all of this, and this is a way for China to gain power by weakening its geopolitical rivals. One of the things that you'll see a lot of DEA officials, and there's been a number of these different government reports pointing out of how there's always been this money laundering network for the cartels, and there's a certain level of irony, right? Because, well, guess what? U.S. financial companies profit quite a bit from this. And the United States, says that it wants to take these hard measures. But at the end of the day, none of the major too big to fail banks that are responsible for billions of dollars of money laundering, none of them are really going to jail. They just get a fine. Whereas, small operators, say somebody who's running a front company, some jewelry store or whatever, those people, they go to prison. They go to prison for 10, 20 years for money laundering. But one of the things that you're starting to see this trend over the last 5 to 10 years, where there's these Chinese organized crime groups that have essentially undercut the competition. And what they've done is, normally it's like a 10 to 15% commission that the money launderers had normally charged. And there's these Chinese operators who are coming in and charging 2%, and they're vastly improving the speed and efficiency of the money laundering network. So let's say you've got $500,000 in drug money there in the United States, and you want to get that money to Mexico or Colombia. There's usually sort of a time gap, from when that money would get to you, the drug trafficker. And now they're making this, almost instantaneous, sort of like a, MoneyGram or Western Union for drug traffickers. And I would describe it as sort of a replica of the Hawala system that's really popular there in the Middle East, that really runs, primarily sort of like on an honor network. But one of the things that, I do want to point out there is that basically with this Chinese system is it's essentially added a third country in there, right? So you have the dirty drug money there in the US. That money needs to get converted to the local currency, say there in Mexico or Colombia, you name it. But what they're doing is now introducing a third country into the system. And then that's really where they make the money. So they're not charging this high commission, to the drug trafficker there in the United States or in South America. What they're doing is it's Chinese people who are buying that US currency. They can make about 10%. So they end up making a similar profit margin. But what you see this common theme from all these different US law enforcement agencies is what they find is that the money launderers are openly conducting this business over this app called WeChat. It's basically the Chinese version of WhatsApp, so it's encrypted. U.S. authorities, they cannot access this, and what they find is that time and time again they'll request, hey, we want to be able to see what these communications say from the Chinese government. And the Chinese government's not allowing this. They're not cooperating in these investigations time and time again. And the reason why I bring that up is because the WeChat, the Chinese government does have the back door to the encryption for WeChat, so they are able to investigate this. They're able to have a major impact on shutting it down. And overall, the resounding opinion is that they're really not cooperating. They're allowing this stuff to happen all out in the open. And I really kind of wanted to point to one last example about that Chinese money laundering is we'll point to a ProPublica article that's going to be included there in the show notes. The title, "The Globe-Trotting Con Man and Suspected Spy Who Met with President Trump," right? So there's this $30 million money laundering operation that eventually got busted. So the person there who's pictured, he was the leader of that group. He was a Chinese national who eventually gained U.S. citizenship. He's a resident of Mexico. Prolific money launderer. He actually owned a casino in Guatemala, but he had all types of ties to the Chinese government. So he'd sell U.S. passports, and just had one of these very sophisticated money laundering operations. He was arrested there in 2021, but what that article points out is that one of his associates, a person named Tao Lu, he's pictured meeting with President Trump at his golf course. So you've got this person who's got all types of criminal background, right? So he was involved in this $300 million cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme in China, but he's not arrested. So again, it fits this profile that I pointed to more so in the last episode. These people who the Chinese government doesn't arrest, but then they go on to sort of, work in this capacity that looks more like the State Department, right? Trying to set up infrastructure deals in Fiji and all these countries where they're trying to gain more influence, basically, part of the unofficially as like the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So, but meanwhile, here's this person who's also involved in this massive money laundering operation for the drug cartels. And if you're just strictly an organized crime figure, you would try to do everything that you could to stay underground. You're trying to stay out of prison, right? In no way, you would never consider, hey, let's go sit there at Trump's golf course and try to get an audience with him. And in multiple times he did. This is a person who, again, the only, in my opinion, logical conclusion to that is that he was trying to gather intelligence information, right? And he was eventually caught. He was, sentenced to 7 years. He was caught trying to buy U.S. passports for someone who he thought was a corrupt State Department official who was actually an undercover DEA agent for, trying to buy those passports for $150,000 each. Again, a U.S. passport, that would be something that would be very valuable if you were an intelligence asset. In my opinion, that's really the only logical conclusion, is that someone who was who's an organized crime figure, like, why in the world would you be trying to get access to Donald Trump when it's just only going to provide all kinds of extra scrutiny? You've got nothing to gain from the organized crime element there, and everything to gain as far as being an intelligence source. And as I've kind of pointed out before, in many cases, that's why what they're doing is because the government has leverage over a person like that. That's why they're again, that's why they're very good, assets for intelligence, is because that they have the ultimate motivation is to stay out of prison. So I do want to point to this quote from, the author of that investigation, is an investigative journalist who I have a ton of respect for, Sebastian Rotella. Quote, "There's a sense that Chinese organized crime acts as an instrument of the Chinese regime in many places, and that this kind of activity is tolerated or allowed due to the benefits to both sides," end quote. And I fully agree with that. Again, there's just this mutually beneficial relationship between both sides. And again, I've covered a whole lot, in the last few episodes with the Chinese government. But again, if you look at my work, I'm pointing out this is not unique to China. The US government does this as well quite a bit. Pretty much every hacker who's, working for NSA or all of these different agencies, they were criminals, and the government flipped them. You can see all types of, again, criminals who were released, for national security reasons. I'm putting that in quote marks as well. DA informants, FBI informants, all types of criminality that the government uses in order to advance its agenda. And I think you can see a number of examples here in this episode and the last episode in which the Chinese government is doing the exact same thing. And I think that this is just important to know to get really a better idea of how things actually work in the real world. So on that note, that's where I'm going to finish. But I would ask, listen, if you got any kind of enjoyment, if you saw any value in this episode, please support the podcast in any way that you want. You can go on the Patreon, you can like and share, you can subscribe, all of those good things. You can, again, share this on social media, however you feel best. And I ask, again, if you did find value in this episode, please support the podcast.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000, plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross, of all 4 hotels in the store. Corleone.